Giorgia Meloni just did what no European leader has dared to do in decades. She stood in front of Ursula von der Leyen, the most powerful bureaucrat in Brussels, looked her dead in the eye and said the one thing that made every EU official in that room forget how to breathe. And von der Leyen's carefully rehearsed smile cracked right down the middle. This wasn't a diplomatic disagreement. This wasn't a policy debate. This was a public execution dressed in Italian elegance. And the entire European establishment just watched their authority get shredded in real time. What Meloni said in those few minutes didn't just challenge Brussels. It exposed the lie that's been holding the European Union together for years. And now every leader from Warsaw to Madrid is taking notes because Meloni just proved something terrifying to the EU elites. You can say no. You can fight back and you can win. For months, Giorgia Meloni played the game exactly how Brussels wanted her to play it. She showed up to the summits. She smiled in the photo ops. She nodded politely when von der Leyen delivered those endless speeches about European solidarity and shared values. The EU establishment looked at her and thought they'd done it again, that they turned another populist firebrand into just another compliant member of the club. They thought the Iron Lady of Italy had learned her place. They were wrong. Catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong, because what they mistook for compliance was actually Meloni watching, waiting, and collecting receipts. She was studying every broken promise, every hypocritical policy, every moment where Brussels preached unity while practicing control. And when the moment was right, when the cameras were positioned perfectly, and the entire European Commission was gathered in one room, she struck. This wasn't an outburst. This was a calculated detonation. The setting was almost too perfect. Another EU summit, another marble hall filled with flags and self-importance, another carefully choreographed display of European harmony. Von der Leyen was doing what she does best, delivering a speech that sounded noble and compassionate, while essentially telling Southern Europe to shut up and deal with problems that Northern Europe created. The topic was migration, because of course it was. It's always migration when Brussels wants to lecture Italy. Von der Leyen stood there talking about burden sharing and collective responsibility, using all those carefully focused grouped phrases that sound good in press releases, but mean absolutely nothing in practice. She was explaining in that condescending tone that EU officials had perfected over decades how Italy needed to be more flexible, more understanding, more willing to accept the thousands of migrants arriving on its shores, while countries like Germany and France built walls and pretended not to notice. It was the same script Brussels has been reading for years. But this time, someone wasn't following along. Meloni sat there listening, and you could see it building. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Something more dangerous. That look of absolute clarity when you realize you're done pretending. The cameras caught it. That moment when her expression shifted from diplomatic patience to what can only be described as controlled fury. And when von der Leyen finished her speech, when she probably expected the usual round of polite applause and agreement, Meloni stood up. The room got quiet. Not the respectful quiet of people waiting to hear what comes next, the nervous quiet of people who sense something is about to go very wrong. And Meloni didn't disappoint. She looked directly at von der Leyen, and in a voice that was somehow both perfectly calm and absolutely lethal, she began to dismantle everything the EU had just said, not with shouting, not with theatrics, with truth wrapped in velvet-covered steel. She started simple. Italy, she said, was done being Europe's dumping ground, done being lectured about compassion by people who've never seen a migrant boat arrive at 3 a.m, done being told to show solidarity by officials who live thousands of miles from the actual crisis. Every sentence landed like a hammer blow, and you could see the EU staffers starting to panic, because this wasn't in the script. Leaders don't talk like this. They don't call out hypocrisy in public. They handle disagreements behind closed doors, in private meetings where uncomfortable truths can be buried under diplomatic language. But Meloni wasn't interested in private meetings anymore. She was interested in making a point, and she was making it where everyone could see. She talked about the nights when Italian coastal towns are overwhelmed, when rescue services are stretched, breaking, when local communities are expected to absorb thousands of new arrivals with zero support from Brussels. And where is the solidarity then? She asked. Where are the shared responsibilities when Italian mayors are begging for help and all they get back is paperwork? The thing about Meloni's attack, and make no mistake, this was an attack, was how surgical it was. She didn't just complain about migration policy. She exposed the entire power structure of the European Union. She pointed out how Brussels makes rules for problems it doesn't experience, how unelected officials override the decisions of democratically chosen governments, how the EU talks about unity while practicing selective enforcement. Northern countries break the rules and get warnings. Southern countries ask for flexibility and get threats. That's not partnership, Meloni said, and her voice could have cut glass. That's a protection racket. You could actually hear people gasp, not metaphorically, actual audible gasps from diplomats who've spent their entire careers avoiding moments exactly like this. Because in EU politics, you're not supposed to say the quiet part out loud. You're supposed to phrase everything carefully, to wrap criticism and compliments, to never directly challenge the fundamental legitimacy of the system. But Meloni just kicked the door down and set fire to the rulebook. She went after the migration pact specifically, that grand compromise that Brussels spent years negotiating. On paper, it was supposed to distribute migrants more evenly across Europe. In reality, it gave Brussels more control while leaving the burden exactly where it's always been, on the southern border states. Meloni spelled it out in terms so clear that even the most willfully blind EU bureaucrat couldn't pretend to misunderstand. This pact, she said, doesn't solve Italy's problem. It creates a monitoring system, so Brussels can punish us when we don't handle your crisis the way you want it handled. And then she delivered the line that made every journalist in the room start typing frantically. We are not Europe's border guards. We are a sovereign nation, and we will not be treated like a subsidiary of the European Commission. The temperature in the room dropped so fast you could practically see frost forming on van der Leyen's smile, because that wasn't just a policy disagreement. That was a declaration of independence. That was Meloni telling Brussels that Italy doesn't work for them anymore. Van der Leyen tried to respond, tried to fall back on those practiced phrases about mutual respect and shared challenges, but you could tell she was rattled. Her usual unshakable composure had cracks in it. Because how do you respond when someone calls you out for exactly what you are? The EU's entire strategy relies on everyone playing along, on national leaders complaining in private but supporting the system in public. Meloni just broke that social contract on live television. She didn't just criticize policy. She questioned legitimacy. She asked the question that Brussels never wants to answer. Who actually elected you to make these decisions? It's the nuclear option in EU politics. And Meloni didn't just press the button. She held it down. She pointed out that van der Leyen wasn't chosen by voters, that the European Commission operates with less democratic accountability than most local councils, that the entire system is designed to insulate decision-makers from the people who have to live with those decisions. You were not elected by Italians, she said, looking directly at van der Leyen. You were appointed by a process most Europeans don't understand and can't influence. So, forgive us if we don't take your lectures about democracy too seriously. The fallout was immediate. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating online. Italian voters were celebrating. Opposition figures across Europe were sharing the footage. And in Brussels, you could practically hear the emergency meetings being scheduled. Because this wasn't just embarrassing for van der Leyen personally, it was existentially threatening to the entire EU project. If Italy, a founding member and the third largest economy in the Union, publicly refuses to play along, what happens next? Do other countries follow? Does the carefully maintained illusion of unity collapse entirely? These are the questions keeping EU officials up at night, and Meloni just made sure everyone was asking them. She didn't do this by accident. Every word was calculated. Every pause was deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew the impact it would have. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. This was political theater performed by someone who understands that in modern politics, the performance matters as much as the policy. But here's what makes this moment truly dangerous for Brussels. Meloni didn't just criticize, she offered an alternative vision. She talked about a Europe of sovereign nations cooperating as equals, not a superstate run by unelected bureaucrats. She talked about respecting democratic choices, even when Brussels disagrees with them. She talked about flexibility, subsidiarity, and actual solidarity, instead of the performative kind that exists only in speeches. And the scary part for the EU establishment is that this vision resonates across Europe. People are tired of feeling like democracy is something that happens to them rather than something they participate in. They're tired of watching their governments make promises during elections and then explaining after the election that Brussels won't allow it. Meloni is giving voice to that frustration, and she's doing it with the confidence of someone who knows she's winning. Her approval ratings in Italy remain strong, her coalition is stable, and now she's positioned herself as the voice of European leaders who are tired of bowing to Brussels. That's not just politically smart, it's potentially revolutionary. So, what exactly did Meloni's brutal takedown accomplish? Did it change EU policy? Did it force Brussels to reconsider its approach? Or did it do something far more dangerous? Did it prove to every frustrated leader across Europe that you can challenge the system and not only survive, but thrive? Because if that's the lesson other countries take from this moment, then what Meloni just started isn't a conflict. It's a movement. And the question Brussels is desperately trying to avoid asking is this: if Italy doesn't have to listen anymore, why should anyone else? And that's the reality Brussels is waking up to. Meloni didn't just challenge von der Leyen. She rewrote the rules of engagement for every leader tired of being told what to do by officials they never voted for. The clips are still circulating. The debates are still raging. And somewhere in Italy, Meloni is probably smiling, knowing she just lit a fuse that Brussels can't extinguish. Because this wasn't about one policy or one summit. This was about power, sovereignty, and who gets to decide Europe's future. Von der Leyen walked into that room thinking she controlled the narrative. She left knowing that control is slipping, and every capital from Budapest to Warsaw is watching, calculating, and wondering if they should be next. The EU wanted unity. What they got instead was Meloni reminding them that unity without respect is just obedience with better branding, and Italy is done obeying. So what happens next? Does Brussels double down and try to punish Italy? Do other countries join Meloni's rebellion? Or does the entire system finally admit what everyone already knows, that the EU's current structure is unsustainable? One thing's certain, European politics just got a lot more interesting. And Meloni isn't finished yet. If you want to stay updated on how this power struggle unfolds, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below. Do you think Meloni is right to challenge Brussels, or is she risking Europe's stability? Let's discuss. And if you found this breakdown valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in European politics, because the mainstream media won't tell you this version of the story. Thanks for watching. The next chapter of this fight is coming soon, and trust me, you don't want to miss.